Hi there.
Hello, how are you doing today?
It's good to be back. I was on vacation. It feels really good to be back.
Oh, that's awesome. Vacation's always a good time.
It is. And now with the virus, now it's drive a little bit into the mountains and then
Mhm.
stay in a quiet place and then come back. So there's no
Yeah.
flying or anything like that.
Yeah, a little reset.
Yes.
All right, so hello to everyone who's joining us today. My name is Stephanie Gordon. So in the activist community, there's a tendency to seek the quickest possible solution to a major problem or need that exists. In order to arrive at quick solutions, people and organizations that are seen as bad actors or who have difficult personalities tend to get left out of discussions. There's a need to solve the problem now, and the belief is often that those people or organizations will just slow down the process. What happens when those people and organizations are excluded from the process? Does it make solutions more or less likely to succeed? Listen to a live talk from Dr. Eric Wolterstorff about why even the worst of the bad actors need to be included. There is a way to include them and make sure that the solutions aren't derailed. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Eric Wolterstorff, founder and CEO of Sovereignty First.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for having me back. Good.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Should I dive in?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think already it's out in the live comments that I'm going to be looking at a lot of particular examples. But we're going to prioritize examples that you all type in. So send us particular examples and we'll run with them, okay?
Awesome.
Okay, so people talk about inclusion in two different ways, the need for inclusion. Some people talk about inclusion because it's inherently a good thing. We want to include everybody. We're nice people. We're all together. We're all human. We're all in the situation. We should all include everybody. That's great, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is if you want to solve a complex problem, you have no choice but to include people. So this isn't about what you should do to be a better person or to be a better community member. This is what you must do if you want your agreements to succeed. So the reason for that is complex problems. Complex could be water issues, the Black Lives Matter that's up, the thing was that the statues, almost everything involving the environment and resource management and global warming. All of those things are highly complex. They have lots of actors, and the key point is solving them requires such broad agreements that those agreements are really easy to sabotage. So that's the point. If an agreement can be sabotaged, then you need to include whoever it might be who's going to sabotage it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
So the theme of this talk is going to be, and I'm just going to pick out example after example of people who it would make sense you would not want to include, but you have to.
Right.
So I'm going to start with a little tiny example, and then I'm going to go to a really big example. I'm going to start with something maybe in a business, something that a project manager might be looking at, and then we'll look at something like agreement around net carbon policies for countries, which is about as complicated as thing I think we can think of in the world. Okay, yeah. So in a business, your project managers often have little or no formal authority. They don't have budgeting or resource allocation authority. What they have is they sit at the middle of a project and they know where all the pieces are. They know what the plan is. So transparency is their friend. And they reach out to people and they say, well, if you want to get from A to B, then you need to get this done before so-and-so does that. And they order and structure things. And again, the only real power that they have is saying, if you want to get from A to B, you need to get these things done in this amount of time and let these other people know about it. Okay? So a project manager is going to be doing part of what they do is that who do we include, and they're also looking at risks. So who do we need to include to deal with risks? So if you don't include someone who can blow up your project, by not funding it, by not sending staff over, by not letting their facilities be used, by not blessing something, then your project's it may not necessarily fail, but essentially you're rolling the dice that that person is going to choose to support your project when the time comes. Okay? If you actually want to be sure your project's going to go through, then you include those people who you don't like, people who criticize your project, people who are just mean, or grouchy, or whatever. You just don't like them. You include them anyway because you really don't have a choice if you want your project to succeed, right? So it's the same thing when we're dealing with something internationally like global warming. It doesn't work if we say, I don't like the point of view of that country because they're a bad actor, because the government treats the people unfairly, or because they lie about their carbon offsets, or it doesn't make any difference if people are bad actors, if they're liars. You still need to include them. You don't have to include everybody, but you need to include enough people, enough organizations that have influence that they can all begin to govern each other. So in a really difficult agreement, that might be 80% of the most influential organizations have to be included. In something that's not controversial and more simple, maybe you just need 20 or 30% of the people to go out and do it. But you got to figure out who are those organizations, and then you got to include them.
Right.
Okay, so what are you thinking? Other examples? I can name some more right now.
Absolutely. So one of the things, of course, that comes to mind is the Black Lives Matter movement, and the views of them being rioters, the views of them taking the chance to stand up against injustice and police brutality. So how would how might you convene parties on both sides to participate in a sort of solution?
Sure. So I'm just thinking about in the United States. The United States it's federalist, so most of the power is in the states, and stronger cities have much more strength within the particular states. So a lot of what's going to happen in the United States is going to happen locally.
Okay.
And there are people who want there to be a large police department. There are people who want a very aggressive policing. There are people who don't want aggressive policing. There's people who want a tiny police department. Well, all the people who affect those have to be dealt with. So you've got the politicians, you've got the police unions, you've got the police officers, you've got all the communities in which the policing occurs with the citizens. You have state and federal as well as local governmental actors who all have to be included.
Right.
Why? Because they could block something. So, for example, if the police union says if they could have the power to get all the people in city council not reelected. Okay, well, that has to be accounted for. That doesn't mean that the solution is everybody has to get half a loaf. Quite often, that's what happens. I want no bread. I want a whole loaf, and you end up with a half a loaf. A lot of times, you get the compromise, but other times, simply by including people, you get more transparency. You can see who the good actors are and who the bad actors are. You can see what motivates the bad actors, and sometimes you can meet their needs without having to agree with their suggestions or positions. Right? This is all basic negotiation. The emphasis in this talk right now is you must include the people who you don't like. Right. One more point on that, which is often you don't know who those organizations and people are ahead of time. So I think Rob spoke last week around if you want to do something about the orangutans in Borneo, and you say, I've got a great idea, I just need to get funding for my program and it's going to go there and work. Well, the problem with that is there's probably literally hundreds of organizations that could ruin your project, who you've never heard of. Businesses, nonprofits, various levels of government agencies, and elected officials, and the police departments, and who forestry, the Ministry of Forestry, all people and organizations who could block this or make this happen. And again, it's likely that you know a lot if you know maybe a quarter of their names. So so great ideas running blindly forward to solve a complex problem is pretty much a recipe for disaster.
That makes a lot of sense, right? So that was a great example of creating that engagement at a local level. How might that apply to an international issue such as climate change?
Well, if there's any kind of cross-border issue, you're going to have different cultures and different governments and different social contracts, as well as the different sectors. So governments just can't solve things because governments are only, even if governments were really quick moving and adaptive, which they're not. Governments are built to move slowly. That's that gives social stability. So governments are really the worst place to go for activism. Governments, they follow very slowly, and they come at the end of the line. So, but the governments have to be accounted for. They have to be at the table, even if they're moving slowly. Often businesses are left out, but businesses have developed networks across borders in any kind of an issue. You've got all sorts of activist groups who are each working with their own agendas with partial information. And then you've got investors who are investing money all around the place. And it's essential to come in and understand what's happening at the capital side, on the investment side. So an example of a different example of this could be, let's say somebody wants to work on a water issue in the country of Jordan. Well, who currently suffers because of the lack of fresh water in Jordan? But who gains from that? Who, because water is very scarce, actually that benefits them. That gives them more political power or more money because they kind of operate at choke points. Or if money is very, very expensive. Let's say people who do bottled water. So we got whole bottled water companies that are doing really well because the water that runs through the pipes is not clean and there's not enough of it. So you get bottled water companies could be really pushing hard to try to protect their piece of the market. So lots of water that's great, but not drinking water. There could be politicians whose whole careers have been built on complaining about and raising the cause of how to solve the water problem. And you would think, and what happens sometimes is the problem gets solved, and then those people say, hallelujah, my work is done here. Right. But quite often that isn't what happens. What happens is somebody has got an entire career, they've got an office, they've got a reputation, they've got money coming to them and to their staff. And if the problem was solved, well then, they'd be out of a job. So quite often they will tend to look at smaller and smaller pieces of a problem and just keep yelling about it, even though the problem's gotten much better, because that's their livelihood. So you get all sorts of interests who have to be dealt with.
That's a fascinating point, and it's very true. Is that a lot of people's livelihoods do depend on their position of holding a stance against one particular issue.
Sure.
That's definitely really important to consider.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So I was going to say, so there's something that those of you who took freshman economics in college may remember a Pareto optimum. And that just means that in some sort of a situation, this can be social as well as economic, that the situation is mature enough that any change will create winners and losers. So this idea of, well, this thing is good for society as a whole does not mean that everyone is going to benefit from it. There are going to be losers. Who are those losers? What can be done to soften their losses, or if they're, or to expose it so the whole community puts pressure on them? What is going to be done with the people who will lose during a change? Every change involves losers. So who are they? how can we deal with them? Because if we don't talk to them and we won't listen to them,
Mm-hmm.
or we ignore them, then they're simply going to act on their own.
Right.
And they'll sabotage. They'll sabotage out of self-interest.
To protect themselves from suffering from those losses that you were describing.
Right, and their priorities may not be yours. Their priority may not be the rainforest. Their priority may be sending their nieces and nephews to school and to the doctor.
Right.
And if you force them in that trade-off, they're going to choose family every single time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to think of more current situations where activists need to think about including people that they don't want to.
Yeah.
And the issue, I'm thinking of the water issues in California right now. And in particular, we're seeing a lot more forest fires, as we do see in this time of year, but quite disheartening. So how might we need to include, for example, big agriculture or the wealthy who are living in LA, and maybe just address why the water issue is a complex problem in California, which we kind of touched on last week, but just for a refresher for those just joining us.
Sure. So there's kind of two different things. One is, who must we include if we want to succeed? And how to include those people. We're not talking about how to include those people. Those people can be included. There's ways to do it, to run negotiations that way, and so on. But that's what we're not talking about that today. We're just saying they need to be included.
Mm-hmm.
Figure out how. And a lot of people can. There's a lot of ways to include those people. But let's say in California, why must any organization that has enough power to influence a solution significantly positively or significantly negatively should try and include, whether you like their position or not. Mm-hmm. So if you don't like what Big Ag is doing in California, well, fine, you're welcome to your opinion, and you can do anything you want, but that doesn't make them go away. Mm-hmm. So to just think of, I'll get the government to change its laws, and it'll make the agriculture do something different, the ag business do something different. Mm-hmm. Well, great. So how are you going to influence all the people in Congress to make that decision for you, or in the state house or the state senate? How are you going to do that? Because the big ag companies aren't going to say, oh, great, we're just going to sit back while you lobby Congress people to destroy our industry or destroy my company. Mm-hmm. They're going to push right back at it.
Mm-hmm. And so, if you were to establish a sort of solution, engage with Congress, get them on your side, and say they implement some sort of policy change, what's not to say that the agriculture business, like Big Ag, is not going to try and sabotage that solution that you've come up with, right? Is that what you're... It's
easy to sabotage solutions, right? You can sabotage solutions by dragging your feet. Mm-hmm. Or you can sabotage solutions by sort of actively doing something to ruin it. So think about, you could have frivolous lawsuits that just slow things down in courts for years and years. Mm-hmm. There are all sorts of ways that maybe a company or a government agency or an investor doesn't like something, they disagree, they don't feel heard, and they're operating in the shadows. They just they tug on other strings. They fund other things less. They cooperate less around other things. There's a lot of ways to directly and indirectly actively sabotage something, and there's a lot of different ways to passively sabotage something. Here's a really simple example. Happens all the time. A kid grows up. They want to go to college, and they want to take a year off and go to the Bahamas and lie on the beach for a week. Mm-hmm. And their parents are paying for college, but the parents refuse to pay for the year off. And they're like, "What the heck? Why not?" And the parents are like, "Hey, it's your life. It's all good. It's all your life. You're a young adult. You can make your own choices." But that doesn't mean I have to fund them. Mm-hmm. So there could be a lot of ways that companies or government agencies or investors are funding things that they just say, okay, you want to do that? That's cool. It's free country. You do what you want.
Mm-hmm.
But then that person steps back and disengages from all sorts of ways that they were helping with something.
Mm-hmm.
It happens on all sides.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, if this is not happy news, but if we've got a really good idea about something, here's how I can help the orangutans in Borneo.
Mm-hmm.
One, that idea has probably been thought of 1,000 times, and it's probably been tried, a dozen or so times, probably, just because, there's 7 billion of us right now. It's not like, it's very rare that any of us has an idea that is even remotely original. There's just too many of us.
Mm-hmm.
And if we happen to be someone who's at the lead of pushing something through, if we run in without including people, we're just going to run into the same brick wall as everybody else ran into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Things can happen, but we need to include people who can affect it.
Absolutely. I think one example that comes to mind, just from studying in my undergraduate degree, we talk about the concept of volunteerism. And so, you get these wealthy people with supposedly good intentions. They want to go do some work in the global south. And one project in particular, they went down to build a school. Hadn't consulted with the local population. They were down there, they were doing their work, they dug the foundation for the school, came back the next day and the foundation was filled in. And that's because they didn't engage with the local population.
Yeah.
They didn't want it, they didn't need it. Their kids needed to be at home doing work with their parents. And so I think we see that a lot is people from the West coming in thinking, this is going to help, but as you said, we need to include everyone. Otherwise, these sorts of sabotage, as you call it, are and will halt any possible solutions.
Yeah, and there's a nice, if you read 3 Cups of Tea, it tells a nice story about that. Well-intentioned, and to give a different example of this, in going back to the country of Jordan, because of the conflict in Syria, there's a very, very large Syrian refugee camp just inside Zatrik, just inside the Jordanian border. And it sits on a water aquifer, and Jordan's already, I think, the second most water-stressed country in the world. And now they've got all of these refugees, and their infrastructure is already overwhelmed. Well, one of the things that these refugees need in the camp is, of course, they need they need medical supplies, they need water, and they need food, and so on. So various UN agencies and development agencies and philanthropic agencies go in to bring a lot of water into the camp and medical supplies and other things. But what do you think the result of that was?
Blocking it, not allowing it to...
No, it was all taken in, and immediately a black market was set up, a black market that ran into Jordan, another black market that ran into Syria, where people took these supplies, ran them out, and sold them as a profit, because they would rather, because it was their trade-offs as individuals. We could, some were just sort of just run by networks that didn't include everybody, so they kept the water and supplies from other people in the camp, but other people had it, and they said, you know what, I can go shorter on water, and I can sell this, and then I can get more money, which can help me to get enough money to send my niece to Italy as a refugee. People are making choices, because the point of this is the water and the medical supplies and the food go into the camps. Immediately, black markets, gray markets spring up to sell these things in Jordan and Syria. One of the things that did is it dealt a huge blow. About 4 or 5 years ago, you had 2,500 Jordanian businesses, small businesses went out of business because they were selling things like, they sold things that competed with water and medical supplies. Well, they're undercut because all of these supplies went free to the camp, went into the black market, were sold at less than market value, and all these businesses went out. So what's happening is people are trying to help the camp, and these organizations are, and they end up weakening the Jordanian economy. And so it was sabotaged by the people. So the people who, the international aid agencies want to help the people in the refugee camp, And the people who are holding the heaviest load with the refugees in the world are the Jordanian citizens. It's in their country. And yet, with outside aid is sabotaging the Jordanian economy, which makes them less capable of taking care of the camps. How can you solve these problems? By actually being inclusive and not trying to force really great ideas on people. I'm going to help you with this great idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a really... And how long were you in Syria for? You were there.
I wasn't in Syria. It was Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq.
Right.
Somebody of our team was in Turkey, all around. We were around the periphery.
Okay.
Dubai. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking of another issue, something that we're seeing in Canada right now, actually, is pipeline projects and the government's failure to consult with Indigenous populations. And so we see protests coming up, protesting the pipeline, and the government's basically trying to just push their way through them or try to bribe their way through to get this pipeline. But then you also see, environmentalists who are saying this is bad for the environment. You see how many liters, barrels of oil are leaked each year by these faulty pipelines. So how, I guess, could you address the need to include a variety of different actors as it relates to pipeline projects?
Sure. So it's not that everyone who wants to solve one of these problems needs to be a convener and include everybody. But if you approach the situation, if you want to drive a particular solution through, that's when you need to convene and bring other people in. So for example, a thing that Greenpeace did, I think it was in the 80s, they would set up these media events that like the Rainbow Warrior boat was it was attacked, and it was shown being attacked, and it raised people's consciousness around what Greenpeace was trying to do. So sometimes raising awareness can be a really good thing, and you don't have to talk to that many people to raise awareness. Good if you talk to more people, but you don't really need to. But if you're actually trying to negotiate or support the negotiations of a solution, then you want to support as many people as possible, and you want to build a coalition. So if you're pushing back against a national government, you better have a pretty big coalition, because the government is big enough that it can ignore people and make huge mistakes that are very hard to stop. So simply to push back and governments are the biggest force, and then secondarily, when you get a passive government or a government that's too close to a particular industry, and then you get the really big companies in that industry, then you could have a similar sort of a thing where if you don't build the coalition to get enough transparency, then you can't even you can't get the oil companies or the government to even join the negotiations, because they're not going to take them seriously. So one reason to include initially is to build enough of a force that other people are going to say yes when you reach out to include them. So initially, let's say with this, you've got an activist organization, and they go to the oil companies and say, change your policies, and they're ignored. And then they go to the government, national government, or the provincial government, and they're ignored. And then you've got indigenous groups doing the same thing, and you've got somebody else. So you get 50 different organizations who are all doing this, and both the government, the provincial and national government, and the big companies can just shrug, because who cares? They're like mosquitoes.
Right.
But if all 50 come together, now there's a force that has to be dealt with, and that includes a lot of organizations that don't agree on a whole lot of different things. So you could get organizations traditionally from the right and from the left. You could get long-time opponents, but they could come together on this one issue, and they say, on this issue, we're on the same side. Which, going back to, do I really need to include those people? Well, Yes. So there are all sorts of issues around which police forces and progressive black activists agree.
Mm-hmm.
And so on those, they need to be able to work together. But it's hard to work together if they vilify each other the whole time.
Right.
Right? Much less around the areas where they have conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So alliances of the moment around particular issues. And it's the way to be most open to alliances of the moment is you constantly want to be willing to work with anybody who's going to help something move forward. And sometimes you hear politicians say this, and like in the United States, you've got Orrin Hatch from Utah, who's very conservative, and Ted Kennedy, who died 15 years ago, I think, very liberal, one from Utah, one from Massachusetts, and that they would work together on certain initiatives. And both of their feelings was, if we have something that's of mutual interest, then great, let's work together. So they didn't see the other as the enemy. They saw themselves as being in different positions from different states with different priorities, who disagree profoundly about all sorts of things, but they're respecting the other people as human beings. They're saying, if I were raised in your shoes, I'd be doing just what you're doing probably. Mm-hmm. And you say the same thing about me. And so we say, okay, what ways can we find to work together? So going back to the, sort of the title of this discussion and talk, do I really need to include those people? Well, yes, because if you've been raised like those people, you would be those people. Mm-hmm. So yes, we work with whoever is essential. Whoever could sabotage an agreement needs to be included in the agreement, up to a certain point. Once you get 80 or 90%, then everybody in the agreement can govern those people who hold out the bitter enders. But until you get almost everybody, you can't govern an agreement.
Mm-hmm. So is it, recognizing the self in the other that you are opposed to? So understanding, as you said, if you were in that person's shoes, you would understand the issue from that point of view. And there's just understanding that we're all born and experience certain things in specific ways that impact our ability to understand, say, a complex problem. So it just recognizing the humanity in the other people, even though you don't necessarily agree with them.
Yes, let's see. Do people have any particular situations or comments or questions or anything? Send those in and we'll look at them. If you're enjoying watching Steph and me talk, that's great. But if you've got something you want to put in, please put that in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody asked earlier about the problem with the political polarization. Mm-hmm. And it just doesn't work to make the other side, bad. Mm-hmm. Just bad. It doesn't work to say. It's one thing to say, as some people said about Obama, a lot of people are saying about Trump right now, this person, I can't stand this person in the presidency. This is just I disagree with the policies. I don't like this person. And to go down a list of 500 problems. Mm-hmm. That's different from saying this person is the source of all evil and they're wrong about everything. Because as soon as something goes into a black-white box, right, we lose the ability to create coalitions. Mm-hmm. Because if somebody's standing for half the country and everything on their side is unacceptable, then how do we connect and work with it and create inclusive coalitions to solve complex problems? Because if half the country isn't going to be engaged in a solution, it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. Just period. We'll be stuck in a polarized gridlock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. When it's polarized, coalitions, as you're saying, if we can't even have a conversation with the person who's the so-called other.
I want to go to Firas's question here. Thank you very much for this, Mr. Mansour. Yeah. Yeah, there's a classic thing that happens with groups that have been formed in opposition. Like the Muslim Brotherhood grew up in opposition for years and decades. And then the switch happens where then a group comes into power, and you can be purist in opposition, and this gives you strength. But then when you're responsible for a whole country, your kind of choice is, are we going to be far less pure right now and include people so we all live together, or are we strong enough to force this purity on everybody? And this is true in any society here. I don't know enough about Egyptian politics to know if that was the reason, but there certainly are profoundly deep networks in Egypt that were connected from with the generals and the military had a whole network there. There was a whole network of power and other government and the formal government, and then there are all sorts of interest in the country as well as the neighbors. And so if someone isn't going to be able to include enough of those to build a coalition, then it falls. So I think, Mr. Mansour, you're answering your own question, which is, sure, yes. This is the basic problem of governments are being forced to be more and more inclusive everywhere around the world, because as more people are educated and they have connection to information through cell phones, it's easier to sabotage things. It's harder to force a population. When people were working on farms and 90% of the world worked as agricultural, as peasants in the land working with crops from morning till night, then they were too tired and not educated enough without enough information to, except for the occasional populist revolution, to do something. But now, people everywhere with cell phones and some education can sabotage things on all sides. That's forcing any form of government, whether it's the Chinese Central Party, or whether it's the government of Ethiopia, it's the government of the United States. If the government isn't sufficiently inclusive, it's going to be degraded and sabotaged on all sides. And if the government isn't either powerful enough or inclusive enough, it's going to fall. Mm-hmm. The world has changed. Citizens have more power than they had 20 years ago. And this is a fundamental change in human history. When we were in small bands and tribes, then we could police each other because we all had that much influence. Mm-hmm. But then we had a couple of 5,000 years of big states where the state could dominate the individuals. And that's been changing in the last generation with the internet and with education. And now it's very hard to force the old thing around. It's hard to herd cats. Well, it's like populations are now like cats, and they just won't do what you tell them to do. Mm-hmm. To some degree, you've got to be inclusive in a way that was not true for 5,000 years of human history. Mm-hmm. Governments, coalitions have to agree. Thank you very much, Mr. Mansour. I hope that was helpful. Right. There's two answers. The question is, it difficult to include ISIS, the IS, in discussions with their ideology? They'll think you're an infidel and they're violent about it. How do you reach out? I think so that's a how question. So we divide this into two parts. The first thing is they must be reached out to. Mm-hmm. How to do it, which is what you just wrote, is the next question. I want to come right back to ISIS and Iraq and the Levant in just a moment. I want to go over to Afghanistan for a moment. After the United States went in and displaced the government mm-hmm. In the end of 2001, then there were the Bonn Accords, which is a big agreement around, what's going to be a new government in Afghanistan, and that's going to move Afghanistan toward democracy. Well, the Taliban was not included because they were considered bad actors, and some of the same critiques around, they would think you're an infidel, they're violent about it. So how do we include those people? Well, the choice was made not to include the Taliban. So it's 19 years later. The Taliban is a strong force in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is not stabilized in an entire generation. So It's a similar thing with ISIS. So there's two parts. One is, so I'm going to go a little tiny bit into how, which is listen to them and publish that information, but publish other people's points of view and create a discussion in which they're part of that discussion and people learn more about them and they learn more about other people. Is that going to change ISIS's behavior or power calculations or purity initially? Not at all. But what it will do is it will create a coalition of all the other interests around ISIS, which are very much fragmented right now. You have the different governments, different internal problems, internal conflicts. There's a difference between how international actors, how the Russians feel about it, the Europeans, the U.S., businesses just trying to go in and run their businesses. There's the coalitions around the problem are not sufficiently inclusive, and they're not sufficiently self-governing. So we'll get the power of the United States, but it's only a half power because the United States won't completely commit. So it's in a halfway and half in and a half out. ISIS hasn't been able to get very far into Iraqi Kurdistan. Why not? Well, in a lot of reasons, Iraqi Kurdistan has its own social contract, which has its own difficulties and problems, but it's strong enough that ISIS hasn't been able to penetrate it. So where there's a strong enough agreement and there is enough inclusion internally, then ISIS you can think of like a virus that it can't get into a system with a strong enough immune system. So building coalitions around ISIS across different sectors, different borders, and making that transparent will be a way to shift the calculus at the edges of ISIS, because no organization is uniform. You have some people who are completely committed on the inside, and then you get people who are less and less committed as you move towards the periphery. Yeah. So the calculus, the join or leave calculus, the compromise or be pure calculus changes among which people and sub-organizations you have. So by creating an inclusive, transparent set of open discussions, you invite the people at the edges to shift, to look for compromise, and you build a stronger coalition, like with the Canadians that we were giving the example of the pipeline. If the activist group and the indigenous groups don't come together into one large coalition, then the government or the oil company can ignore them. Mm-hmm. And if enough smaller organizations band together in shared platforms around an issue, then that forces then those larger organizations or interest that it's in their own interest, their short-term interest, to begin to compromise, or if they refuse, it helps everyone else to isolate them more. So with one hand saying, come in and you play, and we're going to make things, we're going to try to find a way to find a path together. And if you don't come in, then we're going to thoroughly and completely isolate you, which is a very powerful argument when a coalition is strong enough and inclusive enough. Mm. I don't know if this is how I see it from the point of view of this, mm-hmm. of inclusion and the necessity for inclusion. So,
Eric, if I could, I wanted to ask you about migrants on the California border and how to help them who are put in detention, and how to negotiate when they are essentially demonized for what they're doing, trying to cross the border, so-called illegally, and how to engage in negotiations when they are portrayed in a specific way in the political rhetoric.
Right, so that's a really good example where somebody comes in with a very, very strong point of view about what's right or wrong, and then they can be really frustrated that there's a lot of pushback against that point of view. So an initial question would be, who needs to be included in this? Who see this very, very different politically and socially, and why? So the Mexicans need to be engaged, the Mexicans up in Baja in particular, and Mexican businesses and civil society organizations, churches, and the same thing on the California side, the US, the California, the San Diego area, and then there's government agencies. The idea is the more you include, and how to include people effectively in a way that isn't burdensome is an entire issue that's not part of this talk. There are ways to do this, but it requires a commitment. This is just, all this talk is about is why the inclusion needs to happen. So unless, the more organizations and points of view who are included, the more that life gets more complicated. Oh, this is why you see it this way. Oh, it's not that everybody's right. A lot of people are just wrong, and a lot of people are just selfish. But a much bigger problem is a simple lack of awareness. Oh, that's why you could have that point of view. And so by including more people, it gets much more complicated around it. Well, why are these migrants wanting to move into the United States? Well, what does it mean for who are migrants? Are all migrants the same, or are they different? And what does it mean to come into the United States? And then what is the impact of that on the state of California, or and not in a general theory, but with the actual players who are on the ground, the actual organizations involved in this. Why would you have your point of view, which is so different from mine? And what can we do around this? And I guess what I'm saying in a certain way is it's obvious, it's simple what I'm saying, but in practice it doesn't happen. What I'd like to do is take just a minute to list all the reasons why people aren't inclusive. And there are really good reasons. It's super expensive to be inclusive. It's difficult. It's unpleasant. It makes everything less predictable. It can feel morally wrong. There are a lot of reasons why people don't. It's outside of one's mandate and funding. There are a lot of reasons why people aren't. Right? There's a deadline. I need for you to move things forward somehow. And here's enough funding for you and 17 people for 1 year to make this thing happen. Well, now all of a sudden, you've got to make a difference in 1 year with 17 people, or you lose all of your funding. Well, that creates an entire distortive set of incentives, whereas it might take 17 people in a year just to map out and say hello to the organizations who are included. And you've done nothing at this point except for map who needs to be included. And that took 17 people in a year. Well, who wants to fund, 5 years of inclusion and reaching out and open-ended negotiations that lead to these unpredictable self-governing agreements that begin to solve this complex problem over, 1, 2, 3 decades, which is how complex problems are solved. But if we try to solve them faster than that, we end up actually failing or making things worse than before, or polarizing things worse than before. I just missed the one. It's a marathon. It's a marathon, not a sprint. That's right. Sorry. Yeah, or it's much like growing a garden, right? You can't say, tomatoes grow today. When the tomatoes grow when the tomatoes are going to grow, right? You can certainly make it so the tomatoes die, or you can make them grow much happier. But you just can't, make it happen. Oh, this is nice. This is, Mr. Mansour, what a delight, these questions. Closer to home, on a smaller scale, how do you deal with a department head who's consistently not inclusive and seemingly exclusionary? Do you go around them? Yeah, obviously it's trickier in different situations. I mean, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. One thing that can be helpful is to be, there's a whole art called, in business, of managing up, right? So I'm just going to talk about managing up from the point of view of needing to include. You can ask that person to be very, very explicit. And the more explicit that people are, often they catch themselves. They don't want to be explicit. So And you can also, you can lead them innocently. So you can lead them innocently by saying, okay, so it seems like to run these things through the department or get this thing done, I'm going to need approval from so-and-so, and then so-and-so is going to have to second 2 people to us, and so-and-so is going to have to approve this. Which of those things should I worry about, or is somebody else going to do that? So you're asking that in innocence, and you're educating them if they haven't thought about it. So there's ways that you can nudge and push toward inclusion. It's and that also, if that person's going to end up being gone around, eventually you've done it in a much safer way that's going slower and bringing in more actors, at least initially by naming. It seems like we need to include all of these various other people or organizations. And if that's ignored, but you're asking, what do I do with this? That begins to set the stage to be able to reach out to some of those other ones, because then you can say, well, to get this, we're going to run into a roadblock about 3 months here. May I go ahead and ask them? And then you get a yes or no. Yeah, I have to say it's much easier to look at the smaller the problem, the easier it is to apply this.
All right, feel free to send in your questions that you'd like Dr. Wolterstorff to answer.
So what do you do if you're one of the parties that's being excluded? That's a really, really good question. Well, I think there's 2 or 3 answers to that. One is connect with and build relationships with any of the other parties who are included, who would be willing to talk with you. So that just kind of, it puts you on the radar. They become more aware of you. That's the first thing. One way to do it. A second way to do it is, if you have leverage, there is a way in which you can express your leverage without threatening people. You can say, if it's you as an individual, I really don't understand where this is going. And to really help, I need to understand more. Now, if you're one of them, if you're a department or you're part of a subgroup or subculture that's being excluded, it becomes easier to do that, because you can say, it seems like these solutions are only going to work if you've got the buy-in of these people. And then you've got to say specifically what the buy-in is. You've got to say, are these people actually going to participate in these things? Are they going to send their children to these places? Are they going to actually pay attention to the information you're sending out? Are they going to agree with it? Are they going to, whatever it is. You name ways that you're going to need active or passive agreement from being excluded. Otherwise, other problems will arise. And you can ask that in innocence. You can say, wow, if you're always ignoring these people, then look, some bad things can happen. You know, it seems like you guys want a solution on this. I think this group that I'm part of really wants a solution on this. And if we're excluded, you can see some of the bad things that can happen. So you're not doing it then. You're a person who's just being very innocent when you put the news forward. And a version of that, a nice version of that is to say, imagine if this agreement comes through and this subgroup or these people who I'm associated with don't understand it or don't agree with it, and then they do, in innocence, or because it doesn't address their concerns, they do actions X, Y, or Z. Do you see how this whole thing could actually blow up and make it really bad for you and for everybody? You go, oh, wow, okay. So that's a second thing that you can do. A third thing you could do is you just simply begin convening yourself. You just say, fine, that process running, I'm going to run my own process. And let's say I've only got the time and the resources to convene 5 organizations. Well, I'm going to find 5 organizations who are interested in this, and I'm simply going to start that convening process. And maybe we'll be absorbed by the larger one, or maybe we're just going to run in parallel to them. Those are So those are 3 ways that I would begin. Okay. Firas, this is a delight. Thank you so much, and I hope we come back and we're going to be doing this thing weekly, and we've got the online training is how to do inclusion. That's the first of the trainings. Really, really appreciate your engagement. We're closing in on the hour, Stephanie. Is there anything else you want to say to close?
I think I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining another webinar. And for our audience, we have a link in the box below for the first course that is going to be offered by Celebrity First. That's beginning on July 15th. And spaces are limited, so you definitely don't want to miss out on this opportunity. We've got the link in the box below. Dr. Wolterstorff, it was an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I want to thank you. I want to say it feels like we're building a community of interest that hopefully will begin to people talk to each other as well as to us, and it's exciting.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right.
All right. Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions today, and we look forward to joining you next week.
Great.
All for today.
All right.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.